Welcome back to the channel. Did you know in the United States, deep within the quiet valleys of West Virginia, there are railroad tracks that no longer carry steel and smoke, but whispers and shadows? The tracks stretch like scars through forgotten hills, rusted and broken, overgrown by decades of weeds. And yet, every November, the people who live nearby say they hear it. A train that should not exist. The sound begins faintly, as if carried by the wind. A whistle, sharp and mournful, echoing across the ridges. Then comes the vibration, the shudder in the ground, rattling windows in nearby farmhouses, shaking loose dust from attic beams. But there hasn't been a working train here since 1923. The line was abandoned, torn from the schedule, left to rot with the tragedy that ended it. Some say it's nothing more than a tale to frighten children, a fireside story repeated by old men with moonshine in their hands. But others, those who've stood on the hillsides and felt the ground tremble beneath their boots, swear it's real. They've seen strange lights moving along the tree line, glowing lanterns that follow the invisible tracks. They've heard passengers crying, faint sobs and screams that rise in the night air, and those who dare to follow the sound too closely never return to understand why. You must go back to the autumn of 1923. The train was known as the Midnight Special of Dunmore Line, a coal and passenger route that wound through narrow ridges and black tunnels carved into the Appalachians. It was a lifeline for small towns scattered across West Virginia, carrying not only supplies and coal, but children heading to school, families traveling to relatives, and workers bound for the mines. But on the night of November 13th, 1923, the train never made it to its last stop. Eyewitnesses in the valley below said they saw sparks showering from the ridge, as if the earth itself had caught fire. Then came the whistle, long, panicked, echoing with finality. What followed was silence, broken only by a low rumble that turned into a roar. The train derailed. It tore free of the tracks as if pulled by some unseen force and plunged into a ravine. The wreckage was catastrophic. Wood splintered, steel bent and twisted, the engine itself cracking apart on the rocks below. Dozens of passengers, men, women, children, were trapped inside as flames consumed the wreck. By the time rescuers arrived, it was too late. Nearly every soul aboard perished in the inferno, but here is where the story turns from tragedy into legend, because those who recovered the bodies swore something was wrong. The victims, charred and broken, seemed frozen in expressions not of pain, but of sheer, unbearable terror. Their eyes, even in death, were wide open, staring at something no rescuer could see. Some corpses were found clawing at the windows from the inside, others clutching crosses, rosaries, or Bibles. A few looked as though they had tried to leap from the train before it struck the ravine, but their bodies lay on the rocks, broken, in impossible ways, as though they had been pulled violently back toward the wreck. In the weeks that followed, the Dunmore line closed the route permanently. The wreck was buried in landslide debris after heavy rains, sealing the remains of the train within the earth. The tracks were left to rust, swallowed by vines and soil. Officially, the tragedy was blamed on faulty brakes and poor track maintenance, but those who lived in the valley whispered another story. Survivors, what few there were, spoke of something unnatural in the moments before the crash. They described the train going faster and faster, though the engineer pulled the brakes with all of his strength. They remembered shadows flitting along the windows, shapes that moved against the light of the lanterns. One woman swore she saw a figure walking down the aisle, tall, faceless, dressed in black, as every lamp inside the carriage flickered out, and then there was the whistle. Several survivors said they heard it blow 3 times in a row, sharp and urgent, even after the engine had already fallen silent in the ravine. Some claimed the train never derailed at all, that it had been taken. Whatever the truth, the legend was born, and every November, the people of that valley say the dead still ride. They say the ground shakes as the train passes, though no steel wheels touch the rails. They say lantern lights bob in the night, moving in long, endless lines. And sometimes, if you listen closely, you can hear them. The passengers, crying, pleading, calling for help from a train that never stops running. Asterisk, the wreck of 1923 was sealed beneath the earth, but the story of the ghost train had only begun. The first reports came the very next year. In 1924, a farmer named Elias Moore, who lived less than half a mile from the old tracks, claimed he was woken by the sound of his windows rattling in their frames. He thought at first it was thunder rolling across the valley, but then came the whistle, long, hollow, piercing the stillness of the night. Moore stepped out onto his porch, lantern in hand. He swore he saw a light moving down the abandoned rails, glowing white, then red, then fading to a dull orange, as though it were smothered by smoke. The ground beneath him trembled. His chickens stirred violently in their coops, flapping and screeching. And then, he said, came the sound of voices, dozens of them, overlapping, crying out from the darkness. When neighbors asked what he heard, Moore only said, it was like a church service turned into a funeral. Prayers and screams together. All at once, by 1927, the stories were spreading. Children walking home from school claimed to hear phantom footsteps pacing behind them along the rail bed. A group of miners swore they saw a woman in torn clothing standing beside the tracks, waving desperately at them, her mouth open in a scream they could not hear. When they ran toward her, she vanished, but the smell of burning wood lingered in the air. The local sheriff at the time, Robert Keene, dismissed the stories as superstition. But one night in November of 1932, Keene himself was riding horseback across the ridge when his horse froze, ears twitching, nostrils flaring. The sheriff later admitted quietly, only to his wife, that he heard the shrill blast of a whistle. The air grew hot, oppressive, as though the fire from the old wreck had been reignited. He said he felt the horse tremble beneath him as the ground shook, though the rails had long been torn away. What disturbed him most, however, was the sound that followed, the steady rhythm of wheels on track, iron against iron, rolling past him. In the dark. Yet nothing was there. During the 1940s, the stories grew darker. World War II had taken many young men from the valley, leaving small towns half empty, their streets eerily silent. It was during this period that travelers began to vanish. One of the earliest disappearances was a drifter named Henry Lawson. He was last seen on a cold November evening in 1944, heading along the abandoned tracks with a flask in hand. A group of men working late at the mill claimed they heard him singing as he walked, his voice carrying in the still air. Then suddenly, they said, his song was swallowed by the sound of a train whistle. When they hurried toward the tracks to investigate, Lawson was gone. His flask was later found lying on the ground, still warm to the touch, as if it had only just been dropped. His body was never recovered. In 1948, a local family reported that their teenage son, Thomas Ray, had gone missing after daring his friends to spend the night at the old trestle bridge. His friends said they had all been laughing, telling ghost stories when the sound of the train came distant at first, then louder, closer. The ground beneath the bridge shuddered. The boys panicked and scattered. But Thomas stood frozen, staring down the invisible tracks as if he could see something approaching. They swear they heard him shout, "It's right here." Before he was pulled into the darkness. Search parties combed the ravine for weeks, but no sign of Thomas was ever found. The only thing discovered was his cap, snagged on a branch above the very site where the 1923 derailment had occurred. By the 1950s, The legend of the ghost train had become ingrained in the culture of the valley. Parents warned their children to stay away from the rails in November. Hunters refused to track game in the hills after sundown. And yet, curiosity seekers continued to wander into the night, hoping for a glimpse or a thrill. Some returned, with stories of lantern lights swaying in the dark, of faces pressed against unseen windows. Others never returned at all. One particularly chilling account comes from Margaret Holloway, who in 1956 was a young mother living in a farmhouse near the old line. She claimed she woke one night to the cries of her infant son. When she entered his room, she found the window wide open, curtains blowing in a wind she hadn't felt outside. Margaret insisted that she saw figures moving past her window. Dozens of them, faces pale and streaked with soot, staring in at her as though the house itself were just another carriage on the endless train. She clutched her child and prayed until the sounds faded, until the trembling floorboards stilled. But she never again slept with the window unlatched. For 3 decades after the wreck, the stories piled higher, and with them, a growing sense that the ghost train was more than myth. It was not simply an echo of the past, but something alive, something hungry. And those who walked too close to the abandoned line risked being carried off taken as unwilling passengers on a journey with no end. By the late 1950s, the ghost train had become more than just a local legend whispered around kitchen tables. Its reputation began to spread beyond the narrow valleys of West Virginia, carried by traveling salesmen, soldiers returning home, and journalists hungry for strange stories in small-town papers. At first, the outside world laughed. A phantom train rolling through abandoned tracks sounded like little more than backwoods superstition. But then came the reports, articles printed in regional papers. Stories passed by word of mouth, and suddenly, curiosity seekers began to arrive. The first to make headlines was a pair of amateur ghost hunters from Pennsylvania in 1959. They brought with them a heavy reel-to-reel tape recorder, bulky flashlights, and cameras. They camped near the old trestle bridge where so many had vanished, determined to catch proof of the ghost train. The recordings they later played for townsfolk sent shivers through every listener. On the tape, the men's voices are clear at first laughing, joking nervously as the night stretches on. Then comes the sound, a whistle, faint but distinct. The ground shakes, rattling their equipment. One man exclaims, "Do you hear that?" The other replies in a trembling voice, "It's coming right at us." What follows is chaos shouts, the clatter of gear falling, and then, most disturbingly, a sound that no one could explain. It was the low, metallic screech of iron grinding. On iron, though no train had touched those rails in decades, the tape ends abruptly, in silence. The men returned alive, but changed. They refused to speak about what they had seen, only saying that they would never step foot in West Virginia again. By the 1960s, the ghost train had become a destination for the daring. Teenagers drove in from towns miles away, daring each other to sit on the tracks at midnight. Campfires lit the hillsides as groups waited for the phantom whistle. Some returned with wild tales of glowing windows moving past in the dark, of spectral faces peering from the tree line. Others reported nothing at all, only silence. But every November, at least 1 or 2 travelers never came home. In 1965, a professor of folklore from a nearby university, Dr. Howard Finch, visited the valley to document the stories. He interviewed dozens of locals, gathering reports that stretched back to the 1920s. Finch was not a believer, at least not at first. In his published notes, he wrote, "What fascinates me is the consistency of the details." Independent accounts spanning generations describe the same phenomena. A whistle that grows louder despite the absence of a train, a trembling earth, the weeping of unseen passengers. Such unity of description suggests either a collective fabrication or something more troubling. During one of his field visits in November of 1966, Finch and his assistant reported hearing what he called the distinct passage of a heavy locomotive as they stood by the buried tracks. His assistant described seeing faint lights bobbing along the tree line like lanterns held by unseen hands. When they returned to their vehicle, both men discovered long streaks of ash across their windshield, as if a fire had burned directly above them. Finch never returned to the valley. The 1970s marked a turning point. The legend began appearing in national paranormal magazines, tucked between articles about UFO sightings and haunted houses. Travelers from across the country came hoping to witness the ghost train. Some brought equipment, primitive EMF readers, Polaroid cameras, tape recorders. Others brought only their curiosity. One group of college students visiting in 1972 set up a crude stack-out by the trestle. Around midnight, they reported hearing not only the whistle, but the distinct sound of footsteps, dozens of them, marching along the gravel beside the track. When they shone their flashlights, the light revealed nothing but rocks and weeds. Then came the cold. They described the air dropping suddenly, their breath turning white, frost creeping across the ground in seconds. One student panicked, ran for the car, and refused to return. The others held their ground, but later swore they heard voices whispering directly into their ears, though no lips spoke. Their tape recorder captured only static. Yet in the static, faintly, one could hear what sounded like the word help. But the most disturbing account of the 1970s came in 1977. A family of 4 parents, 2 children were driving home from a relative's house late at night. As they passed near the abandoned line, the father slowed the car, pointing toward the hillside. There, he later told police he saw lights, dozens of them swaying in perfect rhythm, as if a passenger train were gliding silently across the ridge. Children began to cry, clutching their mother. She insisted she saw faces pressed against the windows, pale and unmoving. When the father blinked, the vision was gone, but when they arrived home, something strange awaited them. Their car, only an hour earlier in perfect condition, was coated in a fine black soot, thick enough to stain their clothes. Tests later revealed that the soot was nearly identical to the coal ash found in the wreckage of the 1923 disaster. By the end of the 1970s, the ghost train was no longer a local legend. It had become a whispered mystery that reached beyond West Virginia, a story traded among truckers at diners, told by campers around fires, passed along late at night on radio programs. And with each passing November, the question grew darker. The ghost train simply an echo of tragedy, a haunting replay of a single night in 1923? Or was it something worse, something alive, gathering new passengers each year? A train that never stopped running, fueled by the souls it claimed? Asterisk, by the 1980s, the ghost train was no longer just a regional tale. It had been featured in magazines, mentioned on late-night radio, and whispered on long-haul truck routes from Maine to Texas. With the rise of television, the legend caught new fire. Paranormal programs, half documentary, half spectacle, descended on West Virginia, hoping to capture the phantom locomotive. The first attempt aired in 1982, when a small cable crew filmed a special on America's haunted rails. They set up cameras along the buried tracks, positioned microphones by the trestle bridge, and waited. What they captured shocked even the skeptics. At exactly 12:47 a.m., the ground began to quake. The audio equipment picked up a low rumble, deep, mechanical, unmistakable. The cameraman, visibly trembling, panned toward the empty hillside. And then, for less than 5 seconds, the lens caught what appeared to be light reflecting on glass, windows, stretching in a line, glowing with pale blue radiance before vanishing. The crew fled before the night was done. The footage aired only once before the network locked it away. Some claimed it was staged, nothing more than clever trickery, but others swore it was proof that the ghost train was no longer folklore, but fact. As media attention grew, so did the number of disappearances. Police records from 1984 mention a pair of hikers, college students from Virginia, who vanished. After telling friends they planned to camp near the old line, their tent was found days later, zipped shut from the inside. Their sleeping bags were still laid out, but there was no sign of the students. The only clue was a streak of black soot across the tent flap, leading outward like a trail dot. In 1987, hunters reported seeing a full train emerge from the tree-line engine, carriages all glowing with dim, unnatural light. The hunters swore they saw passengers staring through the windows, their faces pale, mouths open in silent screams. One of the hunters, overwhelmed with terror, fired his rifle. The bullet passed through the vision, striking a tree on the other side. The train dissolved into mist, but what truly terrified them came afterward. They claimed they could still hear it, the train rolling along unseen tracks for hours after it vanished. The sound followed them back to their truck, fading only when they crossed out of the valley. The 1990s brought a darker tone to the legend. With each November, it seemed the train grew hungrier. The stories now spoke not only of sightings, but of interactions, encounters where the train seemed aware of those watching. In 1991, a group of thrill seekers from Charleston dared each other to walk the tracks at midnight. They laughed and shouted as they went, carrying beer and flashlights. But when the whistle blew, everything changed. Witnesses, two locals who had refused to join, said they saw the group freeze. The boys and girls stood motionless as a bright light swept across them, like the beam of a headlamp, though no train approached. The witnesses swore they saw shadows passing behind their friends, moving too quickly, too fluidly to be human. When the light faded, 3 of the group were gone. The others stumbled back to town, incoherent, their clothes soaked in ash and moisture as though they had been standing in the rain. But no rain had fallen that night. Police called it a missing persons case. Locals called it another boarding. By 1994, theories began to spread about what the ghost train really was. Some believed it to be nothing more than an echo, a haunting replay of 1923, but others began to suggest darker origins. One local historian, Eleanor Price, claimed she uncovered records of the Dunmore line that hinted at something unnatural. The train that derailed in 1923, she argued, was carrying more than passengers. In its cargo hold, according to faded manifests, were crates labeled only with the word relics. What those relics were, no one knows. But Price believed they were tied to an old Appalachian legend, an artifact said to curse whoever transported it, dooming not only the train but every soul aboard.